Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think that, so other people have focused their research specifically on how knowledge is produced in things like think tanks and then kind of turned into policy. One example is the Heritage Foundation, right? When it was founded, the idea was you need to have something they call the briefcase test, which is that anything that's coming in front of Congress needs to have a background information that can fit inside a briefcase. So you can go to any one member of Congress and open it up and explain to them or give it to them. Then they turned it into just the piece of paper test. So it needed to be 8.5 by 10 A4 paper, front and back, called a backgrounder. And this is everything you need to know. And so ahead of every vote, everyone in Congress gets that. And so if you're like most lawmakers, which is like you're not really paying attention to day-to-day bills appearing, and you get this thing, you're like, oh, okay. I mean, it literally seeds like a kind of a streamlined version of what policymaking could look like. There's other sort of, there's stories for every one of the big policy innovations. So actually standing in the back here is someone who's written a history about how the Bretton Woods system ended. So the creation of sort of groups of economists and bankers talking about the need to move to flexible exchange rates, meeting over the years, putting pressure on policymakers. Yeah, there's a whole story about mobilizing knowledge into policy there that, it's hard to sort of follow alongside this kind of story I'm following. But actually there is a distinction there that's actually really relevant, which is from the 40s when Hayek creates the Mulpellerin Society to the 90s, there was basically one model of disseminating neoliberal ideas according to the orthodoxy, right, which was the think tank. Hayek had this argument about secondhand dealers in ideas. He said, you don't actually target the intellectuals, you target the journalists, or you target the people who make public opinion. And so they did that with degrees of success, but it was always this sort of trickle-down public enlightenment kind of a thing. In the 90s, there was an actual kind of theorization within neoliberal circles about how you can use direct democracy. So the Swiss People's Party, the Austrian Freedom Party are actually writing in the early 90s about how we've always been suspicious of the masses. We always thought democracy was a problem, and therefore we needed to come up with institutions to kind of lock in certain prerogatives of capital. That was just the kind of assumption from the 30s onward. But what if now the elites believe in socialism more than the masses? What if actually the masses don't believe in socialism anymore? What if they are truer capitalists than the policymakers? Then maybe you can weaponize the masses against the elites. So something like direct democracy, the introduction of referendums and things like that is literally theorized anyway, partially in response to things that are already happening. So like, this seems like a bad thing because we generally are very suspicious of like the masses in movement. But maybe there are ways now that, with the way that pension funds have been privatized, with the way that people rely so much on private home ownership as a way of safeguarding their wealth from one generation to the next, intergenerational debt, that people actually see themselves reflected in the market more than they do reflected in kind of imaginary extra market space of like the people or the kind of solidarity of the working class that maybe had once existed in the 1930s when they first started theorizing this stuff. So there is a kind of a switch in the means of doing politics, which is actually why you get more of these dyed-in-the-wool, actual card-carrying Mulpellerin Society guys and women. There's not very many, but there are a couple, like actually taking part in party politics, right? Like running for the Swiss People's Party, running for the AfD. That wasn't something they were doing much of before, right? It was usually kind of sniping from the ivory tower / sort of working with the think tanks, but the idea of actually being, running for office is actually kind of a bit unusual within the kind of neoliberal history. Yeah, your question.